Hello, everyone. Welcome to Immunology 101, the podcast where we talk, you listen, and we all learn. My name is Meagan Moore, and I have here with me Andrea Guzman, Jorden Cutler, Abbi Hammari, and Dallin Cherrington. We're all students of Brigham Young University, Idaho, and we all have a great love for science. Today, we're here to talk about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the development of the Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, and answering the question we receive the most. How is the vaccine effective if the development of it was so rushed? First off, I'd like to talk to my friend Andrea here and ask, what is a coronavirus? And is COVID-19 the first coronavirus that has ever existed?
Hi, Meagan. Coronaviruses are a family of viruses that cause respiratory and intestinal infections in animals and humans. They are enveloped spherical structures that make different proteins that allow them to enter the host cells. The most characteristic protein is a spike-like protein found on their surface that makes them look like crowns or corona in Latin. They contain a small genome inside of their membrane, which is made of RNA. This RNA is subject to changes or mutations that can help the virus adapt to and infect new host species, which is one of the reasons why there are many types of coronaviruses. Coronaviruses weren't considered highly pathogenic in humans until an outbreak of SARS-CoV or severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus occurred in China between 2002 and 2003. Later, another outbreak of MERS-CoV or Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus emerged in 2012 in the Middle East, both thought to have originated in bats. So COVID-19 is not the first coronavirus that has existed. As I mentioned, there were other outbreaks in the past from SARS-CoV and MERS-CoV that caused severe respiratory syndromes in humans. Also, there are other human coronaviruses that include HCoV-NL63, HCoV-229E, and HKU1, which induce only mild upper respiratory diseases host with normal immune response, although some of them can cause severe infections in infants, young children, and elderly individuals. Scientists have been studying coronaviruses for years, so by the time the COVID-19 hit the world, they already knew most of the essential characteristics of this type of viruses and had many options to combat it, including the mRNA and adenovirus vaccines.
So what's an mRNA vaccine, and is that a new thing?
So mRNA vaccines contain mRNA, or a code that enters your cells and tells them to produce a substance that is unfamiliar to the body, and the body will want to attack and defend itself against this substance. In the case of the COVID-19 Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, the code or mRNA will tell your cells to produce the harmless spike protein, not the actual virus. Then your body will produce antibodies needed to defend itself against this infection because it will see the spike protein as abnormal. So when you actually get exposed to the virus, your body will recognize the spike protein and will know how to attack. mRNA vaccines have been studied and been under development since the 1990s, and they have been considered effective against many different types of pathogens. It is not any new technology that scientists randomly came up with right after the pandemic started. In a research study from 2007, the scientists already knew that the spike protein was the main target of the immune system against SARS viruses. This was helpful when the time came to produce a vaccine against COVID-19. Also in 2018, Pfizer and BioNTech collaborated to develop an mRNA vaccine against influenza, meaning that this type of vaccine wasn't even a new thing for these companies. So they already had almost everything they needed to develop a COVID-19 vaccine.
Okay, that's really interesting, actually. Thank you. And earlier you mentioned the adenovirus. What are adenovirus vaccines, and how long have scientists used those?
Okay, so adenoviruses are part of a family of viruses that cause cold-like symptoms, sore throat, diarrhea, and vomiting in humans. To create a vaccine, the genome of an adenovirus is modified by deleting all the parts that will make someone sick. And in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the gene that produces the spike protein is inserted into the genome of the adenovirus. That way, when you receive the vaccine, the harmless adenovirus will go into your cells, and the cells will use the code in it to produce the spike protein. Then the body will see these proteins and will create specific antibodies to defend itself once you are exposed to the actual COVID-19. Adenovirus vaccines have been used for a long time as well. They have been studied to treat other diseases like malaria and avian origin H5N1 influenza. Scientists knew how these types of vaccines work and the main characteristics of coronaviruses. So this is one of the reasons they were able to work on a COVID-19 vaccine this fast.
So, Jorden, Andrea just mentioned these two types of vaccines. Can you tell us more about the key differences between them?
Yeah. So the key differences in the vaccines is the ingredients that kind of go into them. One is an mRNA vaccine. The other is called a viral vector or the adenovirus. Let's talk about the mRNA vaccine first. mRNA stands for messenger ribonucleic acid. mRNA is the only active ingredient in the vaccine. The mRNA molecules contain the genetic material that provide instructions for our body on how to make a viral protein that triggers an immune response within our bodies. The Moderna vaccine is an example of an mRNA vaccine. So let's talk about the vector vaccine or the adenovirus next. Viral vector vaccines use a modified version of a virus that is different from the virus being targeted to deliver important instructions into our cells. The virus vector is used in the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines. This is an adenovirus vaccine as well. The common type of virus that typically causes mild cold symptoms when it infects someone. So basically that's the difference between the mRNA and the viral vector. Kind of what I wanted to lead into with this was the timelines and difference between the COVID being approved versus other vaccines that have been approved. And according to my research I have conducted, a normal vaccine can take anywhere from 10 to 15 years to reach completion. One reason that the COVID vaccine was done so much faster was because of one, there's different phases in every trial for the vaccines, and all of these three phases were combined so that they could get more research done faster. Another reason is that there were so many COVID cases that they were able to do so much more research on this vaccine faster than they were able to do on other vaccines, where they had to wait for people to get sick and they had to wait for them to come in so that they could get tested.
That makes sense.
Right. Kind of the last thing I want to talk about is the kind of the timeline for the both vaccines. So I took the Moderna, which is an mRNA, got their timeline, which should be pretty comparable to other timelines for vaccines of that same for the mRNA. So they started on April 27th, 2020 is when they started the phase 1, 2, and 3. They kind of combined all of them, but the phase 1, like I said, was around April 27th. They completed phase 1 first, then they completed phase 2, and then they completed phase 3. However, while they were completing phase 1, they started on phase 2, and while they were completing phase 2, they started on phase 3. And around February 24th, 2001 is when they completed manufacturing of the clinical trial.
2021.
2021, yes, sorry.
No, you're good.
For the mRNA vaccines. The next is the Johnson & Johnson timeline, which is the viral vector or the adenovirus. They started in January 2020 with sequencing the coronavirus. And like the other ones, they combined all their phases. And then in February 2021, the U.S. Emergency authorization was given to them so that they could produce this and they could roll it out to the public. So, Meagan, I've heard a lot of different numbers for clinical trials. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would actually like to start out. I know a lot of you listeners out there have heard us saying phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, so I just wanted to explain that a little bit. So phase 1 safety trials, according to New York Times, the scientists give the vaccine to a small number of people, and then phase 2, they give it to to hundreds of people, and then phase 3, it's more thousands of people. And when it comes to the clinical trials for the 3 main vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer and Moderna were both performed in one large, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 2-3 clinical trial. Like they said earlier, they combined phase 2 and 3. And for Pfizer, they had more than 43,000 participants and approximately 30,000 for Moderna.
So I've heard you say a lot of crazy words in there, like randomized and placebo-controlled. Can you explain what those mean?
Thanks for pointing that out, Jorden. Basically, in this study, they took all the participants and gave them a dose of the vaccine. Some of the doses were the actual vaccine and others were just placebo, which means a harmless substance that was injected like a vaccine. These doses were given randomly. It wasn't like, okay, we'll give the vaccine to group A and the placebo to group B, like they do in other studies. In fact, neither the participants nor the scientists in this study knew who was given the vaccine and who was given the placebo, which makes it double blind. And a placebo-controlled just means that there was a placebo involved in the process.
So how did they determine the participants?
So before the vaccines went into clinical trials with humans, they were humanely tested on animals in a lab. These animals range from mice to monkeys, depending on the lab that they were tested in. And once they moved into phase 2 of the clinical trial, they were able to reach out to communities to gain participants. Every participant was a volunteer in this process. They looked at the medical history of each volunteer and tried to get as diverse of a group as possible. And there are 3 phases, as I mentioned earlier, and each one grows in number of participants. The numbers that I told you were a summation of the 3 phases. And the first of these vaccines to be approved was the Pfizer vaccine on December 11th, 2020, which was determined to be safe for emergency use. And I'm going to turn it over to Abbi for that one. So on that note, Abbi, how was the vaccine determined to be effective?
So the FDA has regulations in place to make sure that the vaccines are safe for use. The 3 main requirements that they look for are safety, purity, and potency. So to be safe, a vaccine must have very few, preferably none, harmful effects on the vaccine recipient. Pure vaccines have low levels of extra material. The main ingredients need to be the actual things that activate the immune response. If a vaccine is potent, it does what it's supposed to do. In this case, protect against COVID-19 infection.
So were these safety rules followed?
Yes. The manufacturers of each vaccine must send reports to the FDA, and sometimes the FDA even visits the lab where the vaccine is being made to make sure that the vaccines are acceptable. Safety and potency are measured in clinical trials, where percent efficacy and any side effects are actively monitored. The ingredients in the vaccine are evaluated to determine purity. One requirement for vaccines to be authorized for use is 50% efficacy. This means that in clinical trials, the people in the vaccine group should have at least 50% lower risk of COVID-19 than the placebo group. This does not mean that the vaccine only works 50% of the time, or that 50% of the people in the vaccine group will be infected with COVID-19. 50% efficacy means that half of the possible cases were prevented by the vaccine. For example, let's say both the placebo group and the vaccine group had the same amount of people, and the COVID vaccine is 50% efficacious. If 12 of the people in the placebo group got COVID-19, since the vaccine is 50% efficacious, then only 6 people from the vaccine group would have gotten COVID-19. I have good news. The 3 major vaccines in the U.S. all had efficacy above 50%.
Wow.
The Janssen vaccine has an efficacy of about 67%. Moderna has an efficacy of 94.5%. And Pfizer's efficacy is a whole 95%.
Wow.
So the vaccine fills that requirement for being potent. The efficacy rates are so high.
So I've heard some people say that the vaccine was approved just for emergency use. What does that mean?
So normally vaccine manufacturers must submit a biologics license application, or BLA, for the vaccine to be fully approved, which takes a long time and involves more follow-up of clinical trials. But with the pandemic, the vaccine couldn't wait for full approval, so the FDA issued what's called Emergency Use Approval, abbreviated to be EUA, to vaccines that are reviewed and determined safe, pure, and potent. According to the FDA website, the FDA may issue an EUA to allow unapproved medical products to be used in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent COVID-19 when there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. Because COVID-19 is a legitimate public health emergency, EUAs have been given to a few vaccines that have been proven safe and effective.
So, as I said before, this vaccine was approved in December of 2020. So, if this vaccine is only approved because it's an emergency in the pandemic, is it safe?
Don't worry, the FDA has still examined the vaccine to make sure it's safe. They looked at the results of the phase 3 clinical trials to make sure that there's evidence that the vaccine works. That means that 3 rounds of trials had already been completed, so there was lots of evidence that the vaccine is safe and effective. One other requirement for EUA is that the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the risks. It's true that there may be rare side effects from the vaccines, but when compared to the effects of actually being infected with COVID-19, they're not as bad, so the FDA has approved the vaccines for emergency use. One thing to note is once the EUA is given, the FDA still expects further development toward full approval. They're not just going to stop there. Pfizer's vaccine was recently given full approval, and some of the things they did to achieve this were monitor phase 3 clinical trial participants for several more months. And they also conducted 26 studies confirming that the vaccine is effective. This allowed them to have lots of evidence that the vaccine is safe and effective. The other vaccines are also in the process of working towards full approval.
Because the COVID vaccines were developed so fast and there still isn't a full FDA approval, a lot of people are still very hesitant to take the vaccine, which is completely understandable. The COVID vaccines were developed in a year or less, where usually it takes about 6 to 20 years to develop a vaccine. An example of this is the polio vaccine. Polio is a virus that swept through the U.S. and caused a lot of damage. The vaccine for polio was started in the 1930s, but scientists didn't have a vaccine that worked well enough until 1953. Another vaccine we can look at is Ebola. The Ebola vaccine took about 6 years to develop. What we can take away from this is that vaccines take a long time to develop, and then about the same amount of time or a little bit less to get a full FDA approval. COVID started on December 19th, 2019, and the first vaccine was given on December 11th, 2020. That's just under a year, whereas with other vaccines with similar variants, we are seeing 6 to 20 times longer. However, technology has only advanced and helped scientists make this vaccine so fast. All vaccines can have side effects, but are usually pretty minor, like an injection site reaction or fever, but those will go away after a couple days. When we look at people who were vaccinated from the past and look at them again today, they aren't going to have cancer because of a vaccine they received 20 years prior. John Grabenstein, the Director of Scientific Communication for the Immunization Action Coalition, said, "Side effects nearly always occur within a couple of weeks of a person being vaccinated. The longest time before a side effect appeared for any type of shot has been 6 weeks."
Wow, that makes me wonder, why don't we have long-term effects from vaccines?
Well, like I said earlier, a main concern of people not wanting to get the COVID vaccine is because of safety. They don't know what will happen later on once people are observed more after they receive the vaccine. Paul Goetfart, an MD who has been studying vaccines for almost 30 years and is the director of the Alabama Vaccine Research Clinic, said, "A 90% decrease in risk of infections and 94% effectiveness against hospitalization for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines is fantastic. Vaccines are different than medications people take every day for as long as years, and people do see side effects from the frequent ingestion of their everyday medications. This is because you keep giving your body the same medication, so of course you are still going to have side effects. Vaccines are different in that they are injected into the body and then broken down and disposed of. Paul Goatfar, MD, also said, vaccines are just designed to deliver a payload and then are quickly eliminated by the body. This is particularly true of the mRNA vaccines. mRNA degrades incredibly rapidly. You wouldn't expect any of these vaccines to have any long-term side effects. And in fact, this has never occurred with any vaccine. Although COVID vaccines were made in record time by a long shot, they are safe and even safer than everyday medications taken for other illnesses. On the Johns Hopkins website, with featured experts Gabor David Kellen, MD, and Lisa Margarakis, MD, MPH, there is a list of reasons as to why the vaccine could be rushed. The reasons are the COVID-19 vaccines from Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna were created with a method that has been in development for years, so the companies could start the vaccine development process earlier in the pandemic. Another reason is China isolated and shared genetic information about COVID-19 promptly, so scientists could start working on vaccines. The vaccine developers didn't skip any testing steps, but conducted some of the steps on an overlapping schedule to gather data faster. Vaccine projects had plenty of resources as governments invested in research and or paid for vaccines in advance. Some types of COVID-19 vaccines were created using messenger RNA, which allows a faster approach in the traditional way that vaccines are made. Social media helped companies find and engage study volunteers, and many were willing to help with COVID-19 vaccine research. Because COVID-19 is so contagious and widespread, it did not take a long time to see if the vaccine worked for the study volunteers who were vaccinated. Companies began making vaccines early in the process, even before FDA authorization, so some supplies were ready when authorization occurred. Those were just some of the reasons why the vaccine could be rushed, but at the end of the day, it comes down to weighing the pros and cons. We have a lot more proof that vaccines don't cause any major side effects after 6 weeks than we do of vaccines causing any side effects after 6 weeks.